we're at Cafe CLIL number 5, Phil. Have you got your coffee?
I have indeed. I've got my Norwich City mug, which I bought in Norwich when I'm working every summer for Nile. It's a bit faded, and
You've
it's
got a
got
few
Phil
good
on it
ones,
as well.
haven't you? I'm going to have to get one myself because I don't have one.
Yeah.
So we're going to go with kind of paradigms, aren't we? Sort of structures and start and look at the 4Cs and so on, and then see where we go with those threads that come out of looking at the 4Cs. I think I'm going to start with a little bit of history just to put it into context for people.
Go for it.
We've got Uncovering CLIL 2008, the Histomartian Frigols.
Yeah.
And while we have the 4Cs, there's no mention of culture as a dimension in that book. We get cognition above 3 other dimensions: community, content, and communication.
Yes.
And then 2010, Coyle, Hood and Marsh, we get the 4Cs framework. Yep. And that's interestingly surrounded by context. I only really noticed that when I went back to it. So there are 5 Cs really, if you count the context. And there's a circle of culture and a triangle of communication, cognition, and content.
That's right.
And we decided we'd take that, not to bash it as such, but just to sort of pick it apart and see, in the time since then, what's changed. Are we doing things better? Are people still using that? What about the Common European Framework of Reference? And I've heard you talk, Phil, about the problem you have with cognition and content being separate. Would you mind saying a few words about that? Because I think you express it very well.
Yeah. Well, my view of education, as you might know, I'm not the only one, is that unless you critique something, it doesn't move on. I think that goes back to Karl Popper, the idea that a hypothesis only has value if you can challenge it. And it seems to me that the 4Cs were never challenged right from the start. And all of this did culminate in me sitting opposite Doe Coyle, who invented the 4Cs, at a dinner in Dundee. It was a conference, and I'd just written a critique of it in an academic journal, and of course she knew and didn't mention it, but then in the end said, I suppose we'll have to talk about the 4Cs. I said, yeah. And actually what was interesting, she said, I thought she was going to sort of punch me or something in the coffee queue, and she said, thank you for that. She goes, I'm not sure I agree with you, but at least someone's critiqued it at last. So she actually, to be fair to Doe, she actually did like that. And my problem with it, as you say, was that not necessarily the components. I mean, why wouldn't you want cognition, culture, and communication in your curriculum? There's a very useful things to have. Yeah. But my problem with it was as a package. I mean, things tend to be presented in education as packages. They're often 3s and 4s. Yeah. But I think that the package itself has to be coherent, and I don't think it is, because, as you say, the word content heads this 4-tiered package, this 4Cs package. But in what sense are cognition, culture, and communication not content? And I do remember even in the 90s when I met the other CLIL gurus, I felt that there wasn't a clear enough definition of this word content, and I guess we went on to go for the 3 dimensions. We'll talk about that later, but I felt that the content is not simply, it can't simply be the curricular content, as Doe Coyle says, because what is curricular content? Curricular content is not simply conceptual content, as we went on to say. It can also be the how, and it can also be, well, the language and all those other things, the culture, the communication, they're all content. And so the package itself lacks structural coherence, let's say, although its components can be looked at and, can be, of course, used in curriculum.
Yeah. The issue of organizing, planning, preparation, curriculum design, and so on for CLIL, it's likely to suffer from overcomplication in many ways, simply because we try to involve everything, and my take on, I think the three dimensions, concepts, procedures, and language, are a super simple way of thinking about factors involved in preparing for teaching subject matter through another language, and I'm a proponent of culture, intercultural communication. We spread it throughout my school. You know, we have a Jamaica week. It's a fantastic thing. But what I'm free to do is not follow a national curriculum. You know, I made up my own curriculum in my school
Yeah.
in order for our children to learn English. And it's just coincidental that I like to do science and maths. My manager's an artist and she does lots of art stuff. But what I'm talking about here is the opposite. All of these people who are going to be watching and listening to this are likely to be in state schools and institutions, and they have a national curriculum. Mm-hmm. And while the cultural aspect, I think it's a worthy goal, it's not throughout national curriculum guidelines. It's, if anything, it's a kind of pan-European thing, which again I think is really worthy. We want people to be multicultural and multilingual, and the CFR handbook, which was written as an update to the original document, is all about those intercultural skills. But I don't think it's CLIL by default, Phil.
Well, no, it's not. Although, well, Doko tried to defend her position on this, on the culture. She changed and she started, then she put in the intercultural aspect. I mean, as you say, it was in the CEFR. And I remember Doko did write once that CLIL was kind of by default an intercultural act, an intercultural action, because, and I do agree with that, because the very fact that you're studying something in another language and you're being asked to express Einstein's theory of relativity in your third language means that you're borrowing from another culture. You're borrowing from another culture's way of thinking, because if you're using another language, you're borrowing from that way of thinking. That's a great way of thinking about intercultural competence. But there's the sea of culture, isn't there? There's the capital C and what's called the small c. For example, the English national curriculum does also mention intercultural competence, but it's been critiqued, it's been criticised, it's been lambasted, of course, for only concentrating on what's called the small c of culture, and that means things like Halloween. It's Halloween. Let's look at Halloween as that's often used by English publishers of English language materials. Now, it's the classic thing in Halloween. All the publishers come out with something. You can do a good project on sustainability in Halloween. Just
it's almost like a small C for content in terms of a criticism that we've had of publishers who insert a bit of CLIL.
That's right. I mean, I studied French in the 1970s at school, and we had a book. I hope someone listening remembers this. It was called Nous voisons français, and it had a family called la famille Dupont. And the Dupont family, there was always a chapter where the Dupont family would do something.
Okay.
And you were being immersed, as it were, in French culture. And actually, looking back, it wasn't that bad, I suppose. I'd say it was somewhere between the small c and the big C, but it wasn't meant to be part of an intercultural framework. But it's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we need, though, don't we? If CLIL is going to be aligned with developing cultural skills, we really need all national curriculum guidelines to be thoroughly overhauled to respect intercultural communication theory, don't we? Otherwise, it's always going to be an add-on, and then suffer as a consequence to getting little attention and to be slid in, and that's my criticism of it. I think, I would mention one matrix that I came across from a guy at Manchester University years ago, Richard Fay. He uses it's a bit like the Cummings matrix, 4 boxes with 2 cultures, A and B. And he suggested, I never forgot this, in order to develop good cultural communication skills, you need to be able to see how your culture A sees itself.
Exactly.
You need to have a view of yourself and yourselves.
Yeah.
You need to have a view of how culture B sees your culture, so B on A. You need to see how your culture views culture B, And you need to see how culture B sees itself as well. And that sounds complicated, but it's ultimately super simple, because we can put children in situations where they're examining self and selves, and they're examining how, when we e-twin them, they can actually share. But that's what I'm really excited about when I talk about intercultural communication. It's those opportunities for classroom partnering, you know. And again, I don't think it's default CLIL. It should be, but it's not default national curriculum guidelines either.
It's hugely important. It's a political thing too, Keith. You know, obviously, people writing curricula are conditioned, as it were, by their own cultures. That's all also true. But you'll find that certain curricula are more democratic than others, obviously. But as you say, the understanding of another culture rebounds back on yourself and enables you to understand your culture better. And that's the terrible shame of Brexit, isn't it? Let's say it here, you know, the terrible shame of Brexit, and how that itself is also crept into the international curriculum, whether they would admit that or not. But it's just a wonderful parallel there, Keith, as well.
It's absolutely right, Phil.
But I can't remember who said it, but also they said, you don't understand your own language until you study another. And that's also true. I mean, I think we said this before. I mean, I learned English grammar through the study of Latin. I didn't actually, nobody taught me English grammar at school. I mean, there was a little bit, you know.
And it's the same about culture, isn't it? You don't really understand your own culture
until
you step back and have a look at it. You know what I mean? I mean, living in Bulgaria, one of the greatest pleasures I have is showing visiting groups of Erasmus teachers around my wonderful city. You know, I'm not Bulgarian, but I feel like an unofficial ambassador for my beautiful city when they come, and I see the treasure it offers, and we can create those experiences for children in our classrooms too.
Yeah, of course you can. You know,
and a couple of examples about that, because I think that's super important, where I see CLIL does play a role, because I've kind of consulted on a number of projects for colleagues as expert. They can bring in people to help and contribute to their projects. So in the south of Spain, Cork and Holland, a project which looks at transport systems. Sounds very dull, but actually it's a very exciting kind of ethnographic opportunity for children to have a look at cycle paths in the town. Yeah. If you're going to go and see some landmarks, can you do it on foot? Can you do it on a bike or a scooter? Do you have to get a bus, or do you drive there? You know, and that sort of, I call that small C culture, because it's sort of observing behaviors rather than the big arts and literature and stuff of big C. And I think that's where CLIL does play a role, because the common language of communication is going to be a shared one when these groups get together. That's largely English, doesn't have to be. And so the methods of setting up those group discussions and looking at each other's data are where CLIL comes in.
Well, I also think that CLIL teachers naturally go towards that sort of stuff. I mean, towards what we might call critical pedagogy, you know, because what you just described there is critical pedagogy. You're making people think about those aspects of a community, and you know, why, how, what. Again, I think that what you know, why does CLIL start moving towards critical pedagogy? Well, because teachers, in a very basic sense, if they're teaching in a second or third language and the kids are speaking and thinking in a second and third language, well, it's kind of easier to do it if the content is kind of interesting and the kids are being asked to intervene. You know, I mean, that sounds a bit corny, you know, but surely it's true. Surely it's true, you know. If you have a kind of critical pedagogy dimension in your work, and there's no reason why you can't just put it in there. It doesn't really matter what the curriculum is saying. You can always twist it, you know. Then you're more likely to get kids intervening and being interested, because it's, you know, it's tough doing it. It's tough. It can be tough doing it in a foreign language.
I mean, there is still. I might be pushing a point here, but the e-twinning projects are something groups of teachers and their students and schools have opted into.
Yeah.
And so they having opted into that experience, they then set up these intercultural experiences for their children. but I think the national curriculum is something completely different. You know, you have no choice. You have to teach it. It's in some countries law. You know, you're expected to deliver it. And I think that's the problem I have with making culture a dimension of an approach, which is to help teachers teach that legislative document through a foreign language. I think the culture, unless the whole of the curriculum is overhauled, can only ever be an add-on, Phil.
Well, let's move it on a little bit. I mean, we agree on this, but I think that there's also a distinction between, yeah, well, as you're implying, between the curricular framework, which is the law, and what you do in the classroom. But you know, one hopes when you walk in a classroom that what's being done is somehow reflecting something in the curriculum. And you know, in the end, teachers do have to, but they all have their own ways of interpreting it. But if you look at the four C's, I think that's the problem. I don't think it's a lesson plan or a sequence planning paradigm. I don't think it works actually. I think well, it might work for some people. I think again, if people listen to this and say, "Hey, it works for me," well, fine. You know, if it works for me,
it'd be nice to have some examples. I mean, colleagues, please write in, call
yeah,
in, message in, send stuff, and point us in the right direction.
Yeah, but my feeling is that if you take the word content, you know, immediately, like we said before, you say, okay, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about conceptual content? Are we talking about Columbus sailed the
Yeah.
ocean blue in 1492? Or are we talking about what we've called procedural content? You know, how we do it. The how, what is the how that we do it? Well, that might come into cognition and all the rest of it in communication, but it's not clear. So if you take those three dimensions, you say, you know, conceptual, procedural, and the language. That's powerful because the language is across the curriculum. It's not just a language class. You know, the chemistry teacher, we've talked about this before. Or that linguistic element is crucial. And but the language is content, Keith. The language is content. That's where the four C's falls down. For a chemistry teacher teaching in a second language, the language is content. The key language has to be identified. It has to be recycled. It has to be hammered. It has to be used, etc. So how is that not content? I'm sorry. Your books for Macmillan proved that. You know, you took those. You took that. What was it? A lexical, sentential, and a textual view of language, and you just hammered it. You know, you hammered that with all that visual stuff as well. You know, you said if you look at those books, how is language not content, Keith?
Absolutely. I mean, the other aspect of that, of course, is we're still only now at the beginning of joining up those different areas of the curriculum linguistically. You know, even though in the 70s we discovered all teachers are language teachers, but today I think there are moves for teachers to raise their own awareness of where language overlaps in different subject areas, and that can only be healthy. It's not necessarily just CLIL, although we do it by default, I think, looking for those opportunities and areas of overlap. It is the future, isn't it?
It's turning Bullock on its head, isn't it? All teachers are subject teachers. It's a very interesting inversion of Bullock's famous all teachers are language teachers. He was misunderstood, of course. He was talking about language across the curriculum. But it's interesting. All teachers are subject. Well, if you say all teachers are subject teachers, well, they are. But what we mean is that language teachers we've said before, need to move more towards that, let's say, that subject teaching paradigm and the way that can enrich their classes. But we mustn't forget, Keith, I also just get it in quickly, that there's an attitudinal aspect of this as well. And you know, when I finally write this new damn book, it's going to be called The Four Dimensions of Content, because we've moved into competencies. After, you know, we came up with three dimensions, but competence and situation-based curricula have become much more prominent in the world. And so attitudes are now a crucial component of that. And I was talking about this in Zaragoza, no? And you can't talk about social agency. You know, Picardo talks about social agency. She put it into the CEFR. You can't talk about social agency if you don't talk about attitudes. And so attitudes now have become crucial. So unless your curriculum is explicitly attempting to not change the attitudes of students, but stimulate their positive attitudes and positive attitudes towards learning, self-reflection, blah, 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 all the rest of it, and social agency, then the curriculum's failing. And again, I would say that CLIL, and I wrote that paper about this, that CLIL is a great conduit for that as well.
I think so.
But attitude to the fourth dimension, and that's, I don't
Yeah,
want to go, I don't think we need any more dimensions, you know, we don't need
no, no. I
forcing.
mean, it's also one of those dimensions that is throughout everything else, isn't it? So it's
Yes,
difficult to give it its own branch because it is so everywhere in whatever you're doing. You know, attitude is always there.
it's there, Keith, what I'm saying is that if you take it as a if you specify it as a curricular component, then you
Yeah,
have to assess it. And you know, the assessment of attitudes in the past was always a problem, but actually, it's not a problem because if you talk about, you know, if you talk about sustainability, how can there not be attitudinal content in there? What we're trying to get students to have we're not trying to manipulate their attitudes. We're just trying to, in good education, we're trying to get kids to be positive towards their subject content and positive towards their
yeah,
classmates and positive towards their own attitudes towards learning. So, you know, the word attitude shouldn't be misunderstood. There's a
mm,
whole book
mm.
in the word attitudes itself. Maybe I should write it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's material for book just on attitude, isn't there?
Yeah,
Really.
there is.
I
There
mean,
is.
as a dimension for, as we've said, helping teachers get to grips with CLIL. I wouldn't put it in a dimension for helping teachers plan and prepare. I'd keep, like I feel about culture. I think you need to actually have training just about that, and then let the teachers work with what they've learned and
Yeah,
what they've discovered within
yeah,
their own practice.
yeah.
Because I think you risk making it more complicated, which is where we started in the first place with this discussion,
Yes.
isn't it? We don't want things to be too complicated for teachers because they'll get
Well,
lost. You know,
well,
they'll
yeah, and they become kind of abstractions, you know. I mean, if Do Cole was listening to this, she would say, well, I have written what these things mean. I have described them. And of course she has. And you know, if you when you read the descriptors, they're good. You know, they're good. But teachers, I think, in my experience of teachers, is that they don't have time to read that sort of stuff. I'm not being critical here, but they,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
I think that teachers need something that obviously works. And if you take the dimensions, they obviously do. You know, well,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've not come across any teachers, Keith, that I've presented it to who don't like it. And I mean, you've hammered it as well, and you use it in your training, and it does work. I think if you say, look, these four dimensions exist. They exist existentially. They're there. You know, there's always conceptual, procedural, and linguistic content in any class. There's probably also attitudinal content, depends on how much the teacher is emphasizing. But that's the point now. The point is that when you say to teachers, look at this,
Yeah,
so at
yeah,
some point in your class, you will turn up the conceptual volume. Doesn't matter who you are, if you're a language teacher as well. At some point in your class, you might turn it down and you're going to turn up the procedural volume and you say, right, let's get into groups and do this and that and the other. That's turning up the procedural volume. At some point, you'll turn down the procedural volume and you'll say, listen to me, I'm going to explain the concept to you now, you
yeah, yeah,
know. And then you might turn up a language volume and say, the chemistry teacher might say, you know, look at all these passives in this text.
yeah,
So
yeah,
once you say that to teachers, that it's a very simple thing to hook onto. You know,
yeah, I think so.
I'm getting a bit over enthusiastic here, but
No, no, I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to throw in a couple of examples, bringing
please
us
do.
back to culture, from some work with the British Council. We wrote these two books on summer schools. One's called Ethical English, and the other one's called Share Your World. This
Yes,
one is about genetics, because it was around the 50th anniversary of the helical structure of DNA, Crick and Watson, and there was lots of stuff going on. And this was all part of Science Across the World program. And I come back to that because what Science Across the World offered, without really knowing it, was an intercultural program for the learners, because what they got groups of students to do in one country was examine self
yeah,
and look, for example, at with ethical English, we look at healthy eating and look at eating habits, look at shopping habits, chemistry in our lives. Look at cleaning fluids in the kitchen. Talk to grandparents about what they used to use when they were younger for cleaning, and gather stories and share those stories with other partners. And I think that's where really good cultural competence comes in, because you get to observe see other perspectives, but it's the dynamic that we need. You know, I don't think putting it in a paradigm is enough. We need lots of dynamics for teachers to take their picks from, toolboxes. And that's one thing I do really love about Doe's writing, is she always talks about teachers having to find a vision for every lesson. You know, if you discover your kids aren't talking enough, well, make that the vision for your follow-up classes, and you talk less, and make the dynamic happen where they talk to each other. And that's the way I feel about culture. It's one of those dynamics that you know, is not there. I don't think it's great to have it's part of a planning matrix for teachers. But if we want to develop it, then let's do a whole course on it for teachers. You know, exploring and expanding the intercultural competence and the European dimension, which is a thing in the EU, isn't it, throughout the curriculum. So it's not necessarily CLIL, is it? It's not really our default job. It's because we're about the concepts, the procedures, and the language.
Well, it goes back to what Doe said. You know, it science across the world. It's funny you mention it. I was going to mention it about 20 minutes ago, and we didn't quite get it in there. But it's a classic example, Keith. That was great stuff. You know, I mean, and it was a classic example of you know, intercultural competencies, because or intercultural work really, by default, in a sense, you know, is what's going on in your country and what's going on in our country is the same. You know, climate change is affecting us, it's affecting you. Just take an obvious example. Now let's look for local evidence of that, and let's share that local evidence. You know, exactly. that becomes an intercultural act per se. It's the STEAM projects are just going wild now. I mean, in terms of, you know, the digital revolution has permitted kids to talk synchronously across cultures. It's an absolutely wonderful thing. Why would you not have that? But as you said, I think quite correctly, I think that shoehorning culture into that four-tier package, shoehorning it in as an obligatory element is problematic. You know, it doesn't need to be an obligatory element. It needs to come out of, that's a great word. It needs to come out of the dynamic. It's your vision of the teaching. You know?
Sorry, I'm interrupting again. I'm just looking at the clock and thinking about the time, and throwing in ideas for future discussion. And before we met today, we have shared some messages where we say this touches on materials, doesn't it? And I think, you know, we will get to materials as a natural springboard from this discussion, because I mean, I'd like to see a progression of CLIL materials with a 4C that cover a term, you know, because I suspect it's going to have more of this sort of inserted chunk rather than a long conceptual sequence, because it's so difficult, I think.
Well, you could argue that Doe said that in 2010 when she made the cultural. Well, she talked about community as well. Now she kind of changed it to community for a while. She'd seen the problem with culture, I think.
Well, the previous book did use community. We don't know what conversations they had when Marsh and Coyle got together and wrote the follow-up. Maybe this was part of their discussion. I mean, what's this community? Surely it's culture. And then back to community again afterwards.
It went back again. Yeah, I think the community was a clever move also, because it was reflecting again that social agency stuff that was being, you know, put into the CFR, you know, again.
That's the language of the CFR, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And so community, in a sense, quite cleverly covers that, but you could argue it covers culture as well, which you just said. But well, whatever. Okay.
Yeah, I mean the CFR and CLIL, Isabel touched on it when she chipped in a question for us, didn't she? Maybe we can pick that up as well, Phil, and have a look at, I mean, applying that in CLIL teaching, because the CFR is very explicit. It's very explicit about social agency and the skills and the level.
Yeah, it is.
So
Yeah.
maybe that's another theme as well. So we've got materials and we've got CFR. That gives us food for thought.
And you've got also, you've got mediation, and lots of teachers struggle with that as a concept because it's a bit broad. But if you look at mediation in terms of cultural mediation, well, again, you've got a whole content
Yeah,
package there, haven't you?
absolutely.
That's the most obvious use of mediation is intercultural.
When our Erasmus teachers come, I've just had and sent off a group of 10 from Italy. Uh, Part of the week, we do CLIL, of course, but I always get great joy out of letting them taste Bulgarian flavors and smell Bulgarian smells and rose oil, for example. Bulgaria is a massive producer of rose oil for the world's perfume industry. And
No,
not a lot of people know that.
no.
There's a wonderful herb called chubritsa, which is throughout Bulgarian heritage. When you get married in Bulgaria, the mother of the husband has to have a large loaf of bread, which is broken, and then she feeds the bride and the groom with a little dip of bread in honey and a little dip of bread in chubritsa. So you get the sweet and the savory in your rich
Nice.
married life. And that, in a way, I think what we're talking about, and something I love about my work is, I do this with the children in my school, is get them to experience otherness. These teachers all go home in love with Bulgarian Plovdiv, and I think that's as much as important as the CLIL itself is that experience. And I have to say, maybe that's a good word for me to shut up with, is thank goodness for Erasmus Plus.
Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely, and again, we talked about Brexit, didn't we? Well, of course, they've realised the mistake and they're desperately working back towards it. But there you go. I mean, how on earth could you do something which would destroy that?
Not just destroy, so destroy opportunity for young people and teachers, and all the other area of exchange between countries, which is subsidised through the EU.
Absolutely bonkers,
Yeah.
absolutely bonkers, Keith.
Listen, I think
Yeah.
let's not get into a Brexit discussion. Let's close there.
No,
Maybe we
no,
could come back to it, Phil. That's my watch going off for 30 minutes. That's perfect as
cool.
well. Because I think, we could talk about what's Britain going to do about allowing its children to have more opportunities of intercultural experiences, of multilingual experiences, because I think since the Gove ministry, it's been very slow, and then it's basically got chopped, didn't it, with Brexit?
Basically got chopped, and as I pointed out on LinkedIn the other week, that the English national curriculum and its foreign language curriculum is a bit of a disaster area. Well, I think we're coming from a CLIL perspective there, but
Yeah, well, I mean that's the thing,
again,
isn't it?
we're bashing a little bit too easily. I don't want
Yeah,
to. I don't want to feel. I don't want to suggest that
no.
teachers in that system are not doing a good job. I'm
No, of
sure.
course not. Of course
I'm
not.
sure they
We're
are.
lucky, really, Phil. You and I are lucky to be able to live and grow and work in the context we're in, both
Yes,
Bulgaria and the Basque Country, because we've
that's
had
true.
amazing cultural and linguistic experiences ourselves, as well
Yeah.
as professionally.
Yes, yes, that's true.
That's a positive note. So let's stop there.
Yeah, yeah. Let's be positive.
Thanks for coming in, Phil.
Okay, okay. No, brilliant.
We'll
Enjoyed
meet
it.
again next week.
Great stuff.